Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're tackling a really complex subject today, looking at the history of modern Palestine and Israel. And you've brought in some fascinating source material, drawing heavily from, well, what's often called revisionist history.
That's right. It's history that tries to reframe the narrative, to move beyond just the headlines, the high politics.
Right, so not just kings and presidents and declarations.
Exactly. The goal here is to get into the social history, the story of the actual people living on the land, how their lives unfolded, their communities, and crucially, looking at the parts of that story that often get pushed aside, or as the sources describe it, erased and forgotten.
It feels like our mission then is to kind of provide a shortcut through this incredibly dense history. We want to help you, our listener, get a handle on the historical roots of the conflict, but specifically by focusing on who was there and how their world was constantly being reshaped by these huge external forces.
And the central argument, the interpretive lens we're using from these sources, it's quite powerful. It actively tries to weave together different threads, combining the timelines of the, quote, exploiters with the exploited, the invaders with the invaded.
Synthesizing narratives that are usually kept totally separate.
Precisely. And the core insight, the thing we really need to keep in mind throughout this whole deep dive, is this idea that the exclusion of people, both symbolic, like in history books, and real, like physically displacing them from the dominant story of the past, well, that exclusion is identified as the fundamental source of the violence we still see today.
Wow. Okay, so that sets a really high bar for understanding cactability, doesn't it? It implies that how history is told or not told has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. It connects the past directly to the present through this thread of narrative violence leading to physical violence.
So to trace this arc, this story of exclusion and its consequences, where do we start?
We have to go back. We're starting in the mid-19th century during the late Ottoman period. From there, we'll chart the transformation of Palestine through waves of colonialism, through 2 world wars, the incredibly pivotal 1948 conflict, the Nakba.
A catastrophe, yes.
Then through decades of military occupation, and finally, looking at how the peace processes in the early 2000s ultimately and tragically broke down. It's a long sweep, covering about 150 years.
It's a huge time frame. All right, let's dive in. Section 1 takes us from roughly 1856 to the end of World War I, 1918. Before all the major upheavals really kicked in, what was life actually like structurally in Ottoman Palestine? Especially for the majority, the people in the villages.
Yeah, understanding that baseline is crucial. Before, say, 1856, life, especially rural life, had a certain rhythm, a certain stability. It was overwhelmingly centered on kinship, the extended family, the clan, the hamula. That was the absolute bedrock of society.
So everything revolved around the family network.
Everything. Social structures, who held local influence, how disputes were settled, economic cooperation, mutual aid, it all flowed through the Hamala. It was the primary unit of social and economic organization.
And connected to that clan structure was this land system you mentioned, the Musha. It sounds quite unique. Why was it so important?
The Musha system is fascinating and often completely overlooked. It was essentially a system of communal land tenure, but voluntary. The village lands were owned collectively, but plots were rotated among the villagers periodically.
Rotated? How did that work?
Well, imagine the land around a village. Some bits are fertile, close to water. Other bits might be rocky, less productive. Rotation meant that over, say, a cycle of a few years, every family or clan unit would get a chance to cultivate the better plots and also share the burden of the poorer ones.
I see. So it wasn't just about farming. It was fundamentally about fairness, built-in equity.
Exactly that. It acted as an ingrained mechanism to prevent 1 or 2 powerful families within the Hamala from just grabbing all the best land permanently. It ensured a basic level of fairness in access to the means of survival.
So while life was probably hard, maybe patriarchal, as the sources note.
Oh, undoubtedly. We shouldn't romanticize it. It was a patriarchal structure. Life was tough, dependent on rainfall, harvests.
But this system provided a kind of internal stability, a way to manage resources collectively.
Yes, a deep-seated way to ensure communal economic survival and manage internal competition over resources. For the most part, outside of those structures, life followed predictable patterns. The main disruptions were things like, the Ottoman tax collector showing up, which was never welcome, or occasionally military conscription drives.
Okay, so a relatively stable, self-sufficient rural society organized around kinship and this communal land system. But that stability was about to face major shocks. It started, interestingly, with the Ottoman Empire itself trying to modernize, right? The Tanzimat reforms.
That's right. The Tanzimat Running roughly from the 1830s to 1876 was the Ottoman central government's big push to, well, modernize and centralize its own power. They were facing huge pressures.
From where?
Kind of from all sides, really. Internally, you had ambitious local rulers who had carved out their own power bases. You had the stirrings of different national movements within the empire, including early Arab nationalism. And then, maybe most critically, you had the increasing pressure from European imperial powers Britain, France, Russia, who were actively looking for ways to exert influence and control, seeing the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe ripe for exploitation.
So the Tanzimat was an attempt to strengthen the state against these internal and external threats.
Yes, by modernizing the army, the bureaucracy, the legal system, land registration, trying to create a more efficient, centralized state that could stand up to these challenges. But these reforms, imposed from Istanbul, often had disruptive effects locally.
And the sources pinpoint a specific event that really ramps up the external pressure. The Crimean War, 1853 to 56. Why was that war such a turning point for Palestine specifically?
The Crimean War was pivotal because the Ottoman Empire ended up heavily indebted to its European allies, Britain and France. This dependence forced the Ottomans to open up their economy even further to European trade and finance.
So it accelerated economic integration.
Massively. Irreversibly, the sources argue. After the war, Palestine found itself drawn deeply into the European economic orbit. It started exporting raw materials, grain, olive oil, oranges from Jaffa, and importing manufactured goods from Europe. By the 1880s, it wasn't just some remote Ottoman province, it was a clearly defined station on the world economic map.
And this shift towards export agriculture and integration with Europe must have had immediate social consequences. Who rose and who fell in the local power structure?
It caused a significant shift in the balance of power. The traditional rural chieftains, whose power was based more on local landholding and clan leadership, began to lose ground. The real winners were the urban notables, the Akhanate.
The city-based elite.
Yes, families based in Jerusalem, Jaffa, Nablus, Acre. They were often from established landowning families, but they were savvy. They understood how to navigate the new Ottoman administrative structures, the municipalities, the regional councils created by the Tanzimat. They also knew how to engage with the growing European commercial interests, the consulates.
They became the intermediaries.
Exactly. They used their traditional politics of notables leveraging connections, status, patronage, but adapted it to this new, more centralized, commercialized environment. They effectively replaced the rural leaders as the dominant social and political force, and critically, they started consolidating control over land, often registering formerly communal Musha land in their own names under the new Ottoman land codes.
So the reforms meant to centralize power actually ended up concentrating it in the hands of this urban elite, who were also best placed to benefit from the new economic ties to Europe.
That's a key outcome. And this internal dynamic, the shift, was then dramatically amplified by the arrival of entirely new players on the scene. Organized colonizers from Europe starting around 1882.
Okay, who are these groups? The sources mention both Christian and Zionist colonizers arriving around the same time?
Yes, it's striking they appear almost simultaneously. First, you have the German Templars. They were a Protestant pietist group from Württemberg in Germany. Highly organized, very disciplined. They came with a specific vision of establishing agricultural colonies, creating a sort of new Jerusalem in the Holy Land based on hard work and, German efficiency. They established significant colonies near Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem.
And the second group?
The second group, arriving also in 1882 with what's known as the First Aliyah, were the early Zionist settlers, mostly from Eastern Europe, particularly Russia and Romania. They were establishing their own parallel European colonial project, setting up agricultural settlements like Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov.
What's really striking, according to the sources, is the attitude these different groups of newcomers shared towards the people already living there, the indigenous Palestinians.
Yes, despite their different origins and specific goals, the sources argue they shared a remarkably similar outlook. It's described as being, at best, oblivious, and at worst, condescending.
Oblivious or condescending? How so?
Well, the underlying assumption, whether implicitly or explicitly, was that the existing population was somehow backward, stagnant, inefficient. They needed to be modernized for their own good, perhaps by adopting European ways, or maybe they just needed to make way for the superior ideas, technology, and social organization the colonizers were bringing.
So the existing society, culture, economy, the Musha system, the Hamula networks, were basically ignored or dismissed.
Largely, yes. Their own narratives, their own sense of purpose, essentially erased the presence and agency of the people already inhabiting the land. The land was seen as empty or underutilized, waiting for them to redeem it. This outlook is absolutely critical to understanding the seeds of the conflict.
Let's focus specifically on the Zionist context for a moment. We often hear about Theodor Herzl as the father of political Zionism. What drove his thinking?
Herzl's moment of conviction really came during the Dreyfus Affair in Paris in 1894. He was a journalist covering the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish French army captain falsely accused of treason. The intense, virulent anti-Semitism Herzl witnessed, even in supposedly enlightened France, convinced him that assimilation for Jews in Europe was simply impossible.
Even for educated, assimilated Jews like Dreyfus.
Exactly. He concluded that anti-Semitism was an endemic problem, and the only rational solution was for Jews to separate themselves, leave Europe, and establish their own nation-state, preferably in their ancient homeland, Zion. His book, Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, published in 1896, laid out this political vision.
But Herzl's vision was primarily political, diplomatic. The people actually arriving in Palestine in 1882, the first Aliyah settlers, they came from a different background and motivation, didn't they?
Yes, very different. These were the more practical or perhaps territorial Zionists. They weren't waiting for international charters or diplomatic agreements. They were fleeing immediate, brutal persecution, especially the waves of pogroms, anti-Jewish riots that swept through the Russian Empire starting in 1881.
So their motivation was more direct. Escape from violence.
Escape, yes, but also driven by a mix of romantic nationalism, the idea of returning to the ancestral land, and, for many, socialist ideals. Groups like Bilou aimed to create collective agricultural communities. But fundamentally, as the sources frame it, they were seeking to build a European-style nation outside of Europe, driven by the existential threat of anti-Semitism in their home countries. They were the boots on the ground, even before Herzl's political program gained widespread traction.
How did the Ottoman government, already under pressure, react to this new wave of specifically Jewish immigration?
They were certainly aware of it and wary. In 1882, the Sublime Porte, the Ottoman central government in Istanbul, actually passed a law specifically prohibiting mass Jewish immigration and land purchase in Palestine.
So they tried to stop it.
They tried. But Ottoman authority was weakening, and European powers exerted immense pressure. Britain, in particular, used its diplomatic clout, its embassy in Istanbul, to intervene on behalf of Jewish groups seeking to immigrate or buy land. They pressured the Ottomans to ease the restrictions, grant exceptions, or simply turn a blind eye.
So Ottoman resistance was effectively undermined by European interference.
Largely, yes. It demonstrated the limits of Ottoman sovereignty in its own territory and showed how external powers could influence internal policy, especially when it aligned with their own interests or the interests of groups they chose to support. Immigration continued, maybe not always easily, but it continued.
Then as we move into the early 20th century, internal Ottoman politics takes another turn with the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. How did that impact the situation in Palestine?
The Young Turk Revolution was complex. It overthrew the autocratic Sultan Abdul Hamid II and initially promised reform, constitutionalism, and equality for all Ottoman citizens. Many Arabs, including Palestinians, initially welcomed it. But the Young Turks soon pivoted towards a more assertive Turkish nationalism Turkification. They emphasized Turkish language and identity, which started to alienate non-Turkish groups within the empire.
So Turkish nationalism ironically fueled Arab nationalism.
Precisely. Among the Arab intellectual elites in cities like Damascus, Beirut, Haifa, and Jerusalem, both Christian and Muslim, this Turkish focus sparked a corresponding Arab nationalist consciousness. They began thinking more seriously about their own distinct Arab identity, culture, and political future, increasingly defining themselves in secular national terms, anticipating a post-Ottoman world where they would be in charge locally. This intellectual ferment was happening just before the world plunged into war.
And then World War I arrives, and for Palestine, it seems to bring just an unimaginable level of devastation, even beyond the direct fighting.
The war years, especially 1915 and 1917, were utterly catastrophic for the civilian population. It was a convergence of disasters. Natural calamities struck first.
Like what?
Massive locust swarms descended in 1915, devouring crops across the region. This was biblical-scale destruction of the food source. Then, epidemics broke out, cholera hit Haifa hard, typhus was widespread.
And human actions made things even worse.
Exponentially worse. The Ottoman military, particularly under the command of Jamal Pasha in Syria and Palestine, imposed incredibly harsh policies. There was widespread confiscation of food, animals, and supplies for the war effort, but the most environmentally and economically devastating policy was the forced deforestation.
You mentioned this earlier, the Tabor Amlia, the forced labor battalions cutting down trees for railways.
Yes. To support the Ottoman military campaign against the British in Egypt and Sinai, they needed to extend the railway south. Lacking coal, they ordered these labor battalions, essentially forced conscripts, to cut down vast swaths of Palestine's forests.
Not just timber forests, but ancient groves.
Everything. Oak forests, cedars, and, critically, the ancient olive groves that were the backbone of the rural economy for centuries. These trees were felled to provide fuel for the trains and sleepers for the tracks. It wasn't sustainable logging. It was wholesale environmental destruction, stripping landscapes bare. Imagine the long-term impact on soil erosion, rainfall patterns, and of course the livelihoods of villagers who depended on those olives.
The result of crop failure, confiscation, and deforestation must have been famine.
Famine on an unprecedented scale, the sources paint a harrowing picture. Food supplies totally collapsed. People were starving in the villages, but the towns were hit particularly hard as supplies dried up. By 1917, in a city like Jerusalem, reports indicated that around 300 people were dying every month from hunger and related diseases.
300 a month in Jerusalem alone.
It was a period of profound trauma and suffering that decimated the population and the economy. And the grim irony, as the sources note, is that when General Allenby's British forces eventually advanced into Palestine in late 1917, they found their progress significantly aided by the very railway lines the Ottomans had built at such devastating human and environmental cost.
It's a chilling image. Exploitation and destruction literally paving the way for the next phase of external control.
Exactly. It set a very bleak stage for the arrival of the British Mandate.
Okay, let's move into that next phase, the British Mandate period, starting effectively after General Allenby's forces took control in 1917, though formally established a bit later. This entire era, according to the sources, was founded on a fundamental, perhaps fatal contradiction.
Yes, that contradiction is absolutely central. It's embedded right there in the foundational documents of the Mandate, approved by the League of Nations. The Charter basically tried to do two completely incompatible things at once.
Which were?
On the one hand, it incorporated the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised British support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. That was a promise to the Zionists. On the other hand, Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, under which the mandate was granted, spoke about the well-being and development of the existing inhabitants and implied eventual self-government. Britain had also made wartime promises, albeit vague ones, to Arab leaders like Sharif Hussein of Mecca regarding independence.
So promising a national home for one group, while also vaguely promising self-determination for the existing majority population, how could that possibly work?
It couldn't. Not without one promise overriding the other. The language was deliberately ambiguous, full of constructive ambiguity, you might say, designed to give Britain maximum flexibility. But in practice, it created an inherently unstable structure, a political framework designed for conflict almost.
And the British administrative strategy on the ground seemed to exploit this ambiguity to keep the local Palestinian leadership divided.
Absolutely. The sources argue this was a conscious strategy. Divide and rule is perhaps too simplistic, but they definitely nurtured rivalries within the Palestinian elite. The most prominent example is the handling of the Husseini and Nashashibi families, two powerful Jerusalem-based clans.
How do they play them off against each other?
Well, they appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and president of the Supreme Muslim Council in 1921. This gave him immense religious authority and control over significant funds from religious endowments, the Waqf. Interestingly, Haj Amin had initially been seen as somewhat pro-British.
Okay, so they empowered one major faction leader.
Yes, but simultaneously they tended to favor the rival Nashashibi family for positions in municipal government, particularly the mayoralty of Jerusalem and other administrative roles. This created a deep, persistent political schism between the council faction, Husseinis, and the opposition, Nashashibis, that paralyzed Palestinian national politics for much of the Mandate period.
So instead of fostering unity to negotiate with the Mandate or the Zionists, the structure encouraged infighting.
Precisely. It made it incredibly difficult for Palestinians to form a united front, develop a coherent national strategy, or present a strong, unified case to the British or the world. This internal division was a major weakness, actively exacerbated by British policy.
Things seem to come to a head in 1929. The sources call this a real watershed moment. But just before the violence erupted, there was this interesting diplomatic episode around the idea of parity in government. What was that about?
Right, parity. The idea was floated of setting up a legislative council where representation would be essentially equal between Palestinians and Jews, maybe with British officials holding the balance.
The Palestinians were, what, about 90% of the population at that point?
Roughly, yes. Maybe slightly less by 28, but still the vast, vast majority. So initially, Palestinian leaders rejected parity outright. Why should the 90% majority accept only 50% representation? It felt like a profound negation of their demographic weight and rights.
Understandable. But then they changed their minds.
Yes, in 1928, this is quite significant. Facing the reality of growing Zionist political influence and land purchase under the Mandate, the Palestinian leadership, managing a rare moment of consensus across the Husseini-Nashashibi divide, actually agreed to accept the parity proposal. They saw it as perhaps the lesser evil, a way to gain some foothold within the Mandate's political structure before it was too late.
That must have been a major concession given their numbers. How did the Zionist leadership react to this unexpected agreement?
It apparently threw them into confusion, temporarily. They hadn't expected the Palestinians to agree to what was objectively an unfavorable deal for the majority. But after regrouping, the Zionist leadership rejected the Palestinian acceptance of parity.
They rejected it. What did they propose instead?
They countered by suggesting partition, dividing the land into separate Jewish and Arab states. This is a critical moment highlighted in the sources. By refusing parity, even when the Palestinians had reluctantly agreed and proposing partition instead, the Zionist movement effectively signaled its preference for separation over any form of shared governance in a unified state, even one where they might initially have disproportionate influence.
Wow. So the path toward separation rather than integration or co-governance was arguably cemented right there in 1928-29.
That's a key interpretation presented. It preemptively closed the door on a unified political future under the Mandate framework. And this diplomatic impasse immediately preceded the explosion of violence in the summer of 1929.
The 1929 violence, sometimes called the Wailing Wall riots or the Barak Uprising, what triggered it? The sources mention around 300 Jewish and a similar number of Palestinian deaths.
The immediate trigger was heightened tensions around Jewish prayer practices at the Western Wall, known as the Wailing Wall to Jews, and the Barak Wall to Muslims, as it forms the western boundary of the Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount.
A site sacred to both religions.
Incredibly sacred. Minor incidents, disputes over prayer benches or screens escalated rapidly. But the underlying causes were much deeper. There was widespread Palestinian frustration with what they saw as the consistently pro-Zionist tilt of British policy, the continued Jewish immigration and land purchase, and a growing fear, particularly among the masses, that increased Jewish activity at the Wall was part of a deliberate Zionist plan to eventually take over the entire Haram al-Sharif compound, the third holiest site in Islam.
So it was a religious flashpoint layered on top of deep political and economic anxieties, a fear of de-Islamization.
Yes, that phrase captures the fears circulating at the popular level. The violence started in Jerusalem, but quickly spread to other areas, notably Hebron, where a horrific massacre of the ancient Jewish community occurred, and Safad. Jewish communities also attacked Palestinians. It was brutal and widespread.
How did the British respond to this major outbreak?
They suppressed the violence with force, naturally, but they also appointed a commission of inquiry, the Shah Commission, which reported in 1930. And its findings were quite remarkable.
In what way?
The Shah Commission report went beyond just the immediate religious triggers. It explicitly linked the violence to the Palestinians' fear for their economic future, highlighting the growing landlessness and poverty among the peasantry due to land sales and lack of alternative employment. It was surprisingly candid about the negative impact of the Zionist project, as implemented under the Mandate, on the Arab population.
And what did it recommend?
Based on these findings, it recommended significant restrictions on both Jewish immigration and, crucially, on the sale of Palestinian land to Jewish organizations. It recognized that the land issue was fueling the conflict.
Did the British government accept these recommendations?
Yes, initially. The colonial secretary, Lord Passfield, issued a white paper in October 1930 that incorporated the Shah Commission's recommendations, proposing limits on immigration and land sales. This became known as the Passfield White Paper.
There's always a but.
But the Zionist movement, both in Palestine and internationally, reacted with absolute fury. They saw the White Paper as a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate's promise. They launched an intense political lobbying campaign. Key figures threatened resignation.
And the British government.
They buckled under the pressure. Within months, the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, issued a letter to Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader, which effectively reinterpreted and nullified the restrictive clauses of the Pasfeed White Paper. Immigration and land purchase continued largely unimpeded.
So the commission identified the core economic grievances driving the conflict. The government proposed measures to address them, but political pressure immediately reversed that.
Exactly. And the impact on Palestinian perceptions was profound. It reinforced the belief that the British were fundamentally biased, that the mandate machinery was geared towards facilitating the Zionist project, and that Palestinian economic and political concerns would ultimately always be ignored or overridden. This episode is seen as cementing Palestinian disillusionment with British rule.
After this political retreat, the sources describe a period from 1929 to 1936 marked by increasing economic segregation and a real crisis in rural Palestine. How did the economic system divide?
The British essentially allowed the development of two parallel economic systems. The Jewish sector, the Yishuv, was rapidly developing its own institutions, industries, banks, construction, agriculture, the Histadrut Labor Federation, often with capital from abroad. The Mandate government found this financially beneficial.
Beneficial how?
Because the Jewish community, being more urbanized and having a more developed commercial sector, paid significantly more in taxes per capita than the Palestinian community, roughly twice the amount, according to the sources. So, allowing the Jewish economy to flourish, even separately, helped the Mandate's budget.
So a pragmatic financial decision by the British, but with what consequences for the Palestinian majority, especially in the villages where, 60% still live?
The consequences were devastating. It was a perfect storm hitting the Palestinian peasantry. First, the ongoing process of agricultural commercialization, linking them to volatile global markets. Second, the continued, now essentially unrestricted, land purchase by Zionist organizations. Third, the role of the Palestinian urban notables themselves.
How were the notables involved in the rural crisis?
Many of these AN families were absentee landlords owning vast tracts of village land. As land prices rose due to Zionist demand, many found it extremely profitable to sell off large parcels to Zionist funds like the Jewish National Fund, JNF.
Selling the land out from under the tenant farmers who'd worked it for generations.
Precisely. The crucial point is what happened after the sale. The established policy of the JNF and other Zionist purchasing bodies was Hebrew labor, meaning that once land was acquired, the existing Palestinian tenant farmers were systematically evicted, often with little or no compensation, to make way for Jewish settlers.
So this wasn't just a change of ownership. It was a deliberate policy of displacement tied to the land purchase.
Yes. The goal was not just land acquisition, but demographic transformation, creating contiguous areas of Jewish settlement free of Arab tenants. This process wasn't necessarily always violent in the 1930s, but the effect was the dispossession of thousands of Palestinian peasant families.
It connects back to that theme of exclusion being central to the project. It's happening economically and demographically long before 1948.
Absolutely. The foundations for the mass displacement of 1948 were being laid in the economic and social realities of the 1920s and 30s.
What happened to these evicted tenant farmers? Where did they go?
They became landless. Some drifted towards the coastal cities like Haifa and Jaffa, looking for work, often ending up in precarious, poorly paid jobs in construction or the ports, living in shanty towns, tin can settlements that sprang up on the outskirts. Others remained in the countryside but became a landless rural proletariat known as the Harath.
The Harath. How significant was this group?
The sources estimate that by 1931, this group of landless or near-landless peasants might have constituted as much as 30% of the total Palestinian peasant population. 30%. These were people completely cut adrift from their traditional way of life, facing chronic unemployment, poverty, and deep resentment.
And a group like that, desperate, uprooted, with little to lose, becomes politically volatile, right?
Extremely volatile. They were disconnected from the traditional notable leadership, who they increasingly saw as having betrayed them by selling the land. They were deeply suspicious of the British, and they were highly receptive to more radical ideologies and leaders who promised a different kind of solution.
And this is the fertile ground for the emergence of someone like Izz al-Din al-Qassam.
Exactly. Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam is a pivotal figure. He wasn't one of the traditional elites. He was a Syrian preacher who had fled the French occupation of Syria and settled in Haifa. He worked among the poor, the dock workers, the inhabitants of the shanty towns, precisely those displaced and marginalized displaced peasants who had drifted to the city.
What was his message?
He preached a potent mix of Islamic revivalism and anti-colonial, anti-Zionist nationalism. He condemned the corruption of the traditional elites and the failures of their political approach. He advocated armed struggle, jihad, as the only way to liberate Palestine from both the British and the Zionists.
And he didn't just preach, he acted.
He organized clandestine cells, training followers in guerrilla tactics. In the early 1930s, his group carried out attacks against British and Zionist targets in northern Palestine. He became a folk hero, especially among the poor and dispossessed.
His death in 1935 in a shootout with the British seems like a major catalyst.
It was. His martyrdom turned him into a powerful symbol of resistance. He provided a new model, religiously inspired, populist, focused on armed struggle, bypassing the ineffective politics of the notables. His movement and his death are seen as direct precursors, providing crucial inspiration and organizational groundwork for the massive Palestinian uprising that erupted just months later, the Great Arab Revolt of 1936-1939.
It's a picture of escalating tension, radicalization, driven by dispossession. Yet, the sources also insist we shouldn't forget another dynamic happening simultaneously, this natural urge for cohabitation, especially at the grassroots level. Can you explain that?
Yes, this is a really important counterpoint raised in the material. While the high politics, the nationalist elites on both sides, were increasingly driving towards separation and conflict, driven by ideologies of exclusion on the ground among ordinary people, there often remained practical reasons and even a desire for cooperation.
Driven by what?
Often simple economic necessity and shared interests, occupational security, better wages, facing a common employer, or difficult conditions. We see glimpses of this going way back.
Even in the late Ottoman period.
Yes. Integrated economic activity wasn't uncommon then. Merchants traded across communities, artisans worked together. The focus was more on practical business than ethnic or religious division in many spheres.
And this continued into the Mandate period, even as the nationalist projects gained steam.
It did, sometimes in surprising ways. The example given for 1920 is striking. The formation of the very first proper trade union in Palestine. Where does it happen?
In Haifa, you mentioned.
In Haifa's railway and postal services. And who did it unite? Palestinian Arab workers, Jewish workers, and even Arab workers who had come from Syria and Egypt. They banded together to fight for better pay and conditions against their employer, which was the British Mandate administration itself.
So shared class interests overriding national divisions.
In that instance, yes. But what's equally significant is the reaction from the Zionist Labor Federation, the Histadrut.
Who they did.
The Histadrut actively opposed this joint Arab-Jewish union. Their ideology was centered on Hebrew labor and building a separate, self-sufficient Jewish economy. They saw cooperation with Arab workers as undermining that goal, potentially hindering the creation of jobs exclusively for Jewish immigrants.
So the impulse for cooperation from below was met with opposition based on the ideology of exclusion from above.
Exactly. The Histadrut worked to pull Jewish workers out of joint unions and into its own framework. It illustrates that tension perfectly, the practical logic of cohabitation clashing with the political logic of segregation.
Yet, despite that pressure, and despite the escalating violence like in 1929, this grassroots cooperation didn't entirely disappear.
Amazingly, no. The sources point to examples late into the Mandate when tensions were incredibly high. In April 1946, less than 2 years before the 1948 war, there was a joint strike by Arab and Jewish workers in the Postal Service.
1946, that late.
And even later, May 1947, literally just months before the UN partition vote and the slide into full-blown civil war, Palestinian and Jewish workers in the telegraph service went on strike together.
Wow, what does that tell us?
It suggests that for ordinary people, the daily realities of work, shared grievances, and the potential benefits of cooperation could sometimes outweigh the powerful nationalist narratives being pushed by their respective political leaders. This persistent, localized urge for cohabitation, even if ultimately overwhelmed by political forces, is presented as a crucial, often forgotten part of the story.
A potential path not taken, perhaps.
Or a path constantly struggled over between the forces of integration from below and segregation from above.
Okay, this brings us to the critical period around 1948, the Nakba, the establishment of Israel, and the creation of the Palestinian refugee crisis. The past begins with the UN's involvement in 1947.
Yes, after Britain declared it could no longer manage the mandate and handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The UN created a special committee on Palestine, UNSTT.
And UNSTP came back with a recommendation.
It recommended partition. dividing Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem under international administration. This was formalized in UN General Assembly Resolution 181 in November 1947.
How did the two sides react? The sources highlight a real disparity in preparedness.
A stark disparity. The Zionist representatives, led by the Jewish Agency, were described as highly organized, able, and well-prepared. They had effectively lobbied UNSCOP members, they had detailed plans for statehood ready, they accepted the partition plan, though many hoped for more territory later.
And the Palestinian side?
The Palestinian leadership, still represented by the Arab Higher Committee, led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, rejected partition outright. The sources describe this as a consensual rejection. There was little debate, partition was seen as fundamentally unjust, giving away a large part of their homeland. However, critically, they failed to propose any coherent, viable alternative plan.
No counterproposal, like a unitary state with minority rights or a different partition.
Apparently not a well-developed or convincingly presented one. Instead, they largely relied on the broader Arab League, the coalition of newly independent Arab states, to handle the diplomacy and, if necessary, the military response.
And how did the Arab League handle it? You mentioned their strategy was brinkmanship.
Yes, it proved disastrous. The Arab League states made very loud, public threats of military intervention if partition was implemented. Warlike rhetoric was constant. But behind the scenes, the sources argue, there was a catastrophic lack of actual military coordination and preparation. They vastly underestimated the military capabilities of the Yishuv.
So talking tough, but without the means or unity to back it up.
Exactly. It was a policy designed to intimidate and perhaps postpone a decision, but it wasn't based on a realistic assessment of the situation or a unified plan of action. And this disunity was compounded by secret dealings.
This is where King Abdullah of Transjordan comes in again.
Precisely. While the Arab League was publicly proclaiming its united opposition to partition and its defense of Palestinian rights, King Abdullah, who commanded the most effective Arab military force, the Arab Legion, trained and led by British officers, was secretly negotiating with the Jewish Agency.
Negotiating what?
His goal wasn't to prevent a Jewish state, but to manage its emergence while annexing the parts of Palestine allocated to the Arab state in the UN plan, the West Bank, into his own Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan. He effectively agreed with the Jewish Agency to partition Palestine between them, cutting the Palestinian leadership out entirely.
So a complete betrayal of the supposed United Arab Front.
That's how it's presented. This secret agreement meant that when the Arab armies did intervene in May 1948, they lacked a unified objective. Abdullah's Arab Legion focused mainly on securing the West Bank and Jerusalem, largely avoiding confrontation with Jewish forces in areas designated for the Jewish state, while other Arab armies fought ineffectively elsewhere.
This context of diplomatic failure, Arab disunity, and secret deals sets the stage for the military events of late 1947 and early 1948. The conflict intensifies dramatically even before the British officially leave in May 48.
Yes, the period between the UN vote in November 47 and the British departure in May 48 saw escalating violence that amounted to a civil war. Initially, it was somewhat disorganized attacks on roads, bombings, ambushes by both sides. But by March 1948, the Jewish military leadership, the Haganah, launched a new, more systematic offensive.
This is Plan D, Plan Dalet.
Yes, Plan Dalet. The sources describe it as a comprehensive military blueprint. Officially, its objectives were defensive, securing the areas allocated to the Jewish state under the UN plan and protecting Jewish settlements elsewhere. But its implementation, the sources argue forcefully, went far beyond defense.
What were the dual objectives mentioned?
The first was indeed combating Arab irregular forces and preparing for the anticipated invasion by Arab state armies. But the second, and critically important objective in practice, was the systematic cleansing of the territory intended for the Jewish state of as many Palestinian Arabs as possible.
Cleansing? That's a strong word. Does it mean expulsion?
Yes. The plan involved the capture of Arab villages and towns within and even outside the UN-designated Jewish state borders, and the expulsion of their inhabitants or the destruction of the villages to prevent their return. It links directly back to that core theme: the violent exclusion of people seen as an obstacle to the national project.
So it wasn't just about winning military control of territory. It was explicitly about changing the demographic reality of that territory.
That's the argument presented. Plan D provided the operational framework for making the future state ethnically homogenous, or at least overwhelmingly Jewish.
What methods were used to achieve this expulsion?
a combination of direct military assault, psychological warfare, and inducing panic. The sources highlight the massacre at the village of Dur Yassin in April 1948, carried out by Irgun and Lehi paramilitary groups. Not the Hagan directly, but operating within the broader context. Although condemned by the Jewish Agency, the massacre was widely publicized and deliberately used to terrorize other Palestinian communities into fleeing.
Fear is a weapon.
Absolutely. News of Dur Yassin spread like wildfire. This, combined with Haganah attacks using mortar fire, sniper fire into villages, loudspeaker warnings, and rumors of impending attacks, created an atmosphere of intense fear. This led to the rapid collapse and evacuation of major mixed cities like Tiberias, Haifa, Jaffa, and Safad in April and May 1948, often before the British had even fully withdrawn or Arab armies had entered.
What about Haifa? There are sometimes conflicting accounts, suggesting some Arab leaders urged people to stay.
The sources acknowledge those appeals by some local Arab figures and even some British attempts at mediation in Haifa. However, they argue the overwhelming factor was the atmosphere of terror created by Haganah attacks, the memory of Dur Yassin, and the lack of any effective defense or protection. The vast majority fled because they genuinely feared for their lives. The calls to stay were too little, too late, and ultimately ineffective against the military pressure and psychological warfare.
The cumulative result of Plan D and the ensuing war was the Nakba. What were the final numbers?
The outcome was the displacement of approximately 750,000 Palestinian Arabs. They became refugees, fleeing or expelled from their homes and lands.
750,000. What percentage of the Arab population was that in the area that became Israel?
It represented almost 90%. The vast majority of Palestinians who had lived for generations in the Coastal Plains, the Galilee, the Negev, the areas that became the State of Israel were gone. Hundreds of villages were depopulated and subsequently destroyed. It was a catastrophic rupture, the defining trauma of modern Palestinian history.
And for those 750,000 refugees, what did life become immediately after?
They ended up in makeshift camps, primarily in the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank, soon annexed by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, under Egyptian military administration, and also in neighboring Arab countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Initially, they lived in utter destitution, often just under trees or in tents.
And the international community's response? UNRWA.
The UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, was established in 1949 to provide basic assistance. They moved people from tents into slightly more permanent but still very basic structures, often low-walled mud huts or concrete block shelters. The sources emphasize that the very temporariness of this housing reflected the international assumption and the refugees' own desperate hope that their situation was transitional.
Transitional based on what?
Based on UN General Assembly Resolution 194, passed in December 1948, which resolved that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return.
The right of return.
Exactly. That resolution became the cornerstone of Palestinian refugee identity and political demands. But, as we know, Israel refused to allow a mass return, citing security concerns and the desire to maintain a Jewish demographic majority. So, the transitional status became a state of permanent limbo lasting decades, generations even.
In the aftermath of this catastrophe, the old Palestinian political leadership, the notables like the Husseinis and Nashashibis, effectively collapsed, didn't they?
Completely discredited and dispersed, their political approach had failed spectacularly. This created a vacuum, but also an opening for new political forces to emerge, often directly from the crucible of the refugee camps.
Who were these new forces?
The sources highlight the emergence of groups rooted in the younger, often better educated, middle-class generation who had experienced the Nakba firsthand. The most significant, eventually, was Fatah.
Led by Yasser Arafat.
Yes. Founded in the late 1950s, largely by Palestinian students and professionals active in the Gaza refugee camps and also in Kuwait. Its full name was Harakat al-Tahrir al-Watani al-Filistini, the Movement for the National Liberation of Palestine. But the sources point out the significance of the reversed acronym, Fatah, which means conquest or victory in Arabic, a deliberate symbol of turning defeat into future triumph.
What was Fatah's approach?
Initially, it focused on the principle of armed struggle, believing that Palestinians had to liberate Palestine themselves, rather than relying on Arab states. It aimed to be independent of Arab regimes and pan-Arab ideologies.
Were there other groups emerging too?
Yes, absolutely. Many other middle-class activists, particularly those influenced by the prevailing ideologies of the time, were drawn to Marxist groups, or very prominently to pan-Arab nationalist movements. George Habash, for example, another key figure who experienced the Nakba, helped found the Arab nationalist movement, Al-Qawmi al-Arab, which later evolved into the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. So you see different ideological currents emerging from that same experience of dispossession.
Meanwhile, the parts of Palestine not incorporated into Israel were taken over by neighboring Arab states. Jordan annexed the West Bank. How did that relationship play out?
It was complex and often tense. On the one hand, the West Bank Palestinians, with generally higher levels of education and commercial experience, contributed significantly to the Jordanian economy. Amman experienced growth fueled by Palestinian capital and skills.
But politically?
Politically, the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan always viewed the large Palestinian population within its borders with suspicion. They saw them as a potentially subversive community, possibly harboring loyalties to a separate Palestinian entity or susceptible to radical pan-Arab ideas that challenged the monarchy. There was a constant fear of Palestinian secession or political dominance.
Did this lead to conflict?
Yes, tensions periodically flared up. The sources mention a significant Palestinian uprising against the Jordanian regime in 1956, which was brutally suppressed by King Hussein's army, the Arab Legion. This reinforced a sense among many West Bank Palestinians that they were living under a form of occupation or suppression, even if it was by a fellow Arab state.
Okay, let's shift focus to within Israel during this period, the 1950s and 60s. What about the Palestinians who didn't become refugees, the ones who remained inside the new state?
They became Israeli citizens, but their lives were heavily restricted. From 1948 until 1966, the majority of Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under a formal military administration.
Military rule for
Yeah.
citizens.
Yes. Their towns and villages were subject to military governors who imposed curfews, required travel permits to move between villages or cities, and had powers of administrative detention and house demolition.
What was the justification given for this?
The official justification was security, the fear that these Palestinian citizens might collaborate with infiltrators or neighboring Arab states, given the ongoing state of war. However, the sources note that actual instances of such collaboration were rare. The military administration also served as a powerful mechanism of control and surveillance over the Palestinian minority.
Did they have any political rights?
They did have the right to vote in Israeli elections and even to be elected to the Knesset, Israel's parliament. However, the sources suggest this right was often manipulated. The dominant political party at the time, Mapai, the precursor to Labor, skillfully used the military administration and patronage networks to control the Arab vote, ensuring Arab Knesset members were usually aligned with Mapai and didn't challenge state policies effectively. It was a form of co-optation.
Alongside the Palestinian minority, another huge demographic story within Israel at this time was the mass immigration of Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, the Mizrachim.
Yes, hundreds of thousands of Jews arrived in the 1950s and 60s from Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Egypt, and other Middle Eastern and North African countries. This influx was crucial for Israel.
Oh, crucial.
Because Zionism, having established the state, desperately needed population demographic facts on the ground, especially after the Holocaust had devastated European Jewry. The Mizrachi immigrants were actively recruited and brought in to fulfill this demographic need, to populate the new state, and often specifically to settle on the lands and in the towns recently vacated by Palestinian refugees.
So they were settled on former Palestinian land.
Very often, yes. In deserted villages or in hastily built transit camps, Marlborough and later development towns, frequently located in peripheral areas or on confiscated Palestinian property.
What was their experience like in Israel? Was it smooth integration?
Far from it, according to the sources. They arrived expecting Zion, a homeland, but often faced a harsh reality. They encountered what's described as the melting pot process, which was essentially an attempt by the dominant Ashkenazi European Jewish establishment to impose cultural assimilation.
Forced acculturation.
Yes. Their Arab languages and rich cultural traditions were often looked down upon, dismissed as primitive or Levantine. Children were discouraged from speaking Arabic in schools. There was pressure to adopt a secular, Europeanized Israeli identity.
And economically.
Economically, they often faced discrimination. They were frequently channeled into manual labor, becoming a cheap workforce that helped build the country, but also, ironically, displaced many of the remaining Palestinian Arab workers from sectors like agriculture and construction. They also faced institutional discrimination.
How so?
The sources point to examples like access to state benefits. Many benefits, like subsidized housing loans or grants for university education, were linked to having served in the military. While Mizrachi men were conscripted, they often lacked the networks or qualifications to access the full range of benefits enjoyed by the more established Ashkenazi population, creating deep socioeconomic gaps and resentments that persisted for decades. They experienced a form of internal exclusion within the Jewish society itself.
This whole period, the 50s and 60s, seems characterized by the consolidation of the state, demographic shifts, but also underlying tensions with the Palestinian minority within the Jewish majority. This culminates in another war, the Suez Campaign of 1956. How do the sources interpret Israel's involvement in that?
They suggest it wasn't just about the immediate triggers, Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, border clashes with Palestinian Fedayeen infiltrators from Gaza. It was also driven significantly by internal Israeli dynamics. The increasing dominance of a militaristic ethos within Israeli society and politics. Figures like David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, and Moshe Dayan, the chief of staff, represented a hawkish approach. They actively sidelined more moderate, dovish figures like Moshe Sheret, who had briefly served as prime minister and advocated for diplomacy and integration.
So a struggle between hawks and doves.
A struggle the hawks decisively won. Ben-Gurion, the sources argue, pursued a policy based on military strength, preemptive action, retaliation raids against Arab states, and an underlying vision of a greater Israel, the idea that Israel should eventually expand its borders. He's portrayed as someone who consciously amplified tensions, exploited Arab instability and rhetoric, and largely ignored any potential Arab signals towards peace or accommodation, preferring to maintain a high state of military readiness and eventually seeking an opportunity for a second round against Egypt.
So the Suez War, where Israel allied with Britain and France against Nasser's Egypt, is seen partly as an outcome of this internal hawkish ascendancy.
Yes, driven by this militarized political culture and the marginalization of alternative, more conciliatory approaches within the Israeli leadership at the time. It set a pattern for future combats.
This leads us directly into the next major turning point, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the beginning of the long era of occupation. Section 4 covers this period, from 1967 up to around 2005. The war itself was a stunning military victory for Israel.
Absolutely stunning. In 6 days, Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and occupied vast territories. The Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria.
It quadrupled the territory under Israeli control overnight. What was the immediate aftermath? There was talk initially of enlightened occupation.
That phrase was certainly used particularly by figures like Moshe Dayan, who became defense minister. The idea was that Israel would administer the territories efficiently, bring economic benefits, and allow a degree of local autonomy, perhaps avoiding the harshness of other military occupations.
Was that the reality?
The sources argue strongly that this was largely a myth, propaganda almost. From the very beginning, the occupation was characterized by policies of control, displacement, and the assertion of Israeli sovereignty, contradicting the notion of enlightenment.
What specific policies point to this? You mentioned immediate expulsions.
Yes, expulsion policies were implemented almost immediately, despite the enlightened rhetoric. The sources cite the example of the Mughrabi Quarter, an ancient neighborhood adjacent to the Western Wall within Jerusalem's Old City. Just days after capturing East Jerusalem on June 10, 1967, the residents, all Palestinian Arabs, were given a few hours' notice before bulldozers moved in and demolished the entire quarter to create the large plaza in front of the Western Wall that exists today. Hundreds were made homeless instantly.
Wow, just days after the fighting stopped.
Just days. Similarly, residents of several villages in the Latrin salient near the road to Jerusalem were expelled and their villages destroyed. And refugee camps near Jericho, housing refugees from 1948, also saw significant numbers of residents forced out, pushed across the Jordan River. These weren't isolated incidents. They reflected a pragmatic concern within the Israeli leadership about the demographic implications of absorbing such a large Palestinian population. Expulsion was seen as a solution.
For those who remained under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, what was this system of rule?
It was full military rule. Israel immediately applied the British Mandates Defense Emergency Regulations of 1945, ironically. Regulations the Zionists themselves had fiercely condemned as draconian when the British used them.
What did these regulations allow?
They gave military commanders sweeping powers, imposing curfews, restricting movement through checkpoints, conducting searches without warrants, administrative detention, imprisonment without trial, censorship, deportations, and critically, the demolition of houses as collective punishment against families of suspected militants. These tools became the daily reality of the occupation, stripping Palestinians of basic civil and political rights.
So far from enlightened, it was based on pre-existing colonial emergency laws.
Exactly. It established a legal framework for control and suppression from day one.
Alongside the military and political control, this period also saw the emergence of a powerful religious justification for holding on to the newly occupied territories, didn't it?
Yes, this is absolutely crucial for understanding the permanence of the occupation and the settlement movement. The 1967 victory was interpreted by many religious Zionists in messianic terms as a divine miracle, a sign of impending redemption.
And specific religious leaders gave this interpretation authority.
The key figure highlighted is Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook, the head of the Merkaz Harav Yeshiva in Jerusalem and son of a foundational religious Zionist thinker. He delivered influential sermons and rulings arguing that the territories captured Judea, Samaria, the biblical terms for the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem were integral, sacred parts of the divinely promised land of Israel.
And
Therefore, relinquishing them to non-Jewish rule would be a religious prohibition, a betrayal of God's plan. This provided the profound spiritual inspiration and theological justification for the Jewish settlement movement, particularly Gush Eminim, Bloc of the Faithful, which emerged in the 1970s. They saw themselves as pioneers fulfilling a religious commandment by settling these lands.
So the occupation wasn't just strategic or political. It gained this deep religious ideological underpinning that made compromise much harder.
Much, much harder. It elevated the conflict beyond territory and security into the realm of sacred duty for a significant and highly motivated segment of Israeli society. Other figures, like the then Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren, also issued halakhic rulings, Jewish legal opinions, forbidding withdrawal and sanctifying Israeli sovereignty over the whole land.
This combination of military control, settlement expansion, and religious ideology forms the backdrop to the next major Palestinian uprising, the First Intifada, which began unexpectedly in December 1987. What finally lit the fuse?
The sources describe it as an explosion born out of sheer accumulated frustration, the intolerable routine of 20 years of occupation. It wasn't orchestrated by the PLO leadership, who were then based far away in Tunis. It was a spontaneous popular eruption.
What were the key elements of that frustration?
Several things converged. Decades of daily humiliation at checkpoints, house searches, arrests, the perceived failure of the PLO's diplomatic and armed struggle strategies to achieve anything tangible, and critically, the economic consequences of what the sources call creeping annexation.
Creeping annexation. What does that mean economically?
It refers to the way the Palestinian economy in the West Bank and Gaza became deeply integrated with and dependent on Israel's economy. Many Palestinians found work inside Israel, often in low-paid construction or agriculture, because local economic development was stifled. Israeli policies discouraged investment in Palestinian industry and agriculture to prevent competition.
So dependency without development.
Exactly. It created jobs, but also fostered resentment. Palestinians were contributing to the Israeli economy, but seeing little benefit or prospect for their own economic independence. Savings rates declined. Young people saw no future. This economic despair, combined with the lack of political hope, created a powder keg. The immediate spark was a traffic incident in Gaza, where an Israeli truck killed 4 Palestinian workers, but the uprising was rooted in these deeper structural issues.
What was the nature of the Intifada itself? How was it organized? The sources compare it to the 1936 revolt, but note key differences.
Like the 1936 revolt, it drew much of its energy from rural Palestine, the villages and refugee camps, rather than just the cities. But the organization was strikingly different. Unlike the 1936 revolt, which was eventually led by the traditional notable committees, the First Intifada was initially coordinated through grassroots democratic popular committees.
Popular committees, how did they work?
These were essentially ad hoc local councils, often formed spontaneously by villagers, activists, women's groups, professionals. They organized local resistance demonstrations, commercial strikes, tax boycotts, alternative education when schools were closed by the army, even neighborhood watch groups. Because they were so decentralized and locally rooted, Israeli intelligence found them incredibly difficult to penetrate or decapitate. You couldn't just arrest a few leaders and stop it.
So a much more resilient bottom-up structure than previous resistance efforts.
Yes, representing a significant shift away from the old elite politics towards mass participation.
You mentioned women's groups. What role did women play in the Intifada?
A very prominent and visible role. The sources suggest the Intifada served as a kind of catharsis for Palestinian women who faced what's described as a double burden, meaning the pressures of living within a generally patriarchal society with its traditional expectations and limitations, combined with the daily grind and specific burdens imposed by the Israeli occupation, husbands or sons arrested, homes raided, economic hardship. Many women, especially in camps and villages, were working low-paid jobs in Israel or Palestine while still shouldering all domestic responsibilities. The Intifada provided an outlet for this immense pressure, and women were actively involved in organizing, protesting, confronting soldiers, and sustaining the popular committees. It led to a marked increase in their public political participation.
How did the Israeli military and government respond to this largely unarmed popular uprising?
The response under Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin at the time was harsh. The initial policy was famously described as force, might, and beatings, aiming to break morale through physical punishment rather than just arrests. Yes, widespread use of clubs, mass arrests often accompanied by severe beatings during roundups or interrogation. There were also increased house demolitions, extended curfews that paralyzed communities for days or weeks, and the use of live ammunition against demonstrators, leading to hundreds of deaths over the course of the Intifada. A new tactic was also introduced, declaring entire villages or areas as secure military areas, completely sealing them off, which was another form of collective punishment.
While the Intifada raged and the occupation continued, some critical voices started to emerge within Israeli society itself. There was the Peace Now movement and also something more intellectually radical termed post-Zionism. How did they differ?
They differed significantly in their fundamental premises. Peace Now, which actually formed earlier, back in 1978, after Anwar Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, represented the moderate Zionist left.
What was their position?
They advocated for withdrawing from the occupied territories, primarily based on pragmatic arguments. The demographic threat of absorbing millions of Palestinians, the corrosive effect of the occupation on Israeli society and its soldiers, and the need for security through peace agreements. They were often called security doves.
But they operated within the Zionist consensus.
Firmly within it. They didn't generally challenge the foundational narratives of Zionism or the events of 1948. Their focus was on ending the occupation for Israel's own good, rather than necessarily addressing the core Palestinian grievances stemming from the Nakba or demanding equal rights.
How was post-Zionism different?
Post-Zionism, which emerged more prominently in academia in the late 1980s and 1990s, was a much more fundamental critique. It directly challenged the core tenets and founding myths of the Zionist narrative itself.
Led by whom?
Primarily by a group of scholars who became known as the New Historians, people like Benny Morris, Ilan Pappé, Avi Shlaim. Using newly declassified Israeli archives, they began to systematically revise the conventional Israeli history of the 1948 war.
What do they find or argue?
They challenged the narrative that Palestinians fled voluntarily, providing evidence for widespread expulsions under Plan D. They questioned the portrayal of Israel as a David facing an Arab Goliath in 1948, highlighting Arab disunity and Abdullah's secret deal. They also critiqued how the memory of the Holocaust was sometimes used within Israeli society and politics.
How was the Holocaust memory critique framed?
Some post-Zionist thinkers argued that the trauma of the Holocaust was occasionally manipulated, used instrumentally to justify Israeli policies, silence criticism, or even in extreme cases to dehumanize Palestinians by drawing parallels between them and Israel's former persecutors, a kind of Nazification of the Arabs within state ideology or public discourse. This was obviously highly controversial.
So post-Zionism was a direct assault on the self-image and historical justification of the state.
Exactly. It sought to deconstruct the dominant, often heroic and self-justifying Zionist narrative and introduce a more critical, multi-perspectival understanding of the past, acknowledging the Palestinian experience, particularly the Nakba, as central to Israel's creation.
Did this academic critique filter out into wider Israeli culture?
Yes, to some extent, during the 1990s particularly. The sources note its influence in Israeli film and theater. For the first time, you started seeing depictions of Palestinians not just as terrorists or backward villagers, but as complex human beings, sometimes even sympathetic figures or heroes.
Do you give examples?
The film Behind the Bars, 1984, is mentioned, where a Palestinian political prisoner and an Israeli criminal prisoner find common ground and lead a joint prison revolt. That was quite groundbreaking. Even more rarely, a film like Crossfire, 1999, based on a new historian's work, attempted to show the 1948 war from the Palestinian perspective, depicting the fear and confusion in Jaffa when the UN partition vote happened. This represented a significant, though perhaps temporary, opening in Israeli cultural discourse.
But while these intellectual and cultural debates were happening, the political track was moving towards the Oslo Accords, signed in 1993. This seemed like a major breakthrough. Why do the sources ultimately frame Oslo as a tragedy?
It's framed as a tragedy primarily because of what it failed to address and how it ultimately unraveled. While the image of Arafat and Rabin shaking hands on the White House lawn was incredibly hopeful, the Oslo Accords themselves were structured as interim agreements.
Meaning they postponed the hardest issues.
Precisely. They established the Palestinian Authority, PA, with limited self-rule in parts of Gaza and the West Bank, but deliberately deferred the core final status issues, the ones that really mattered, to later negotiations. These were the fate of the 1948 Palestinian refugees, the right of return, the status of Jerusalem, claimed by both sides as their capital, the borders of a future Palestinian state, and the future of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, which actually continued to expand throughout the Oslo years.
So the foundations for a lasting peace weren't really laid.
The argument is that by avoiding these core issues up front, Oslo created a process that lacked a clear destination and allowed spoilers on both sides to undermine it. Furthermore, the way Israeli security control was maintained, the fragmentation of the West Bank into different zones, areas A, B, and C, and the continued settlement growth meant that for many Palestinians, the occupation didn't really end, it just changed its form.
The final negotiations at Camp David in 2000 collapsed. Why?
According to the sources, the final offer presented by Israel and the U.S., particularly regarding Jerusalem and the refugee issue, was seen by Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership as falling far short of minimum Palestinian requirements. Specifically, the demand that Arafat formally renounce the refugees' right of return in perpetuity was something he felt he could not do, as it represented a core element of Palestinian identity and historical grievance. Accepting it would have been political suicide and seen as a betrayal of the Nakba generation.
So Arafat refused what he saw as a humiliating deal.
Yes. While the Israeli narrative often blames Arafat for rejecting a generous offer, the sources sympathetic to the Palestinian perspective argue the offer itself was fundamentally flawed and didn't address the core issues equitably. The collapse of Camp David, followed by provocative actions on the ground, led directly to the next phase of violence. And the sources also argue that the Oslo process, in its implementation, particularly regarding Gaza, effectively turned it into a huge prison, increasingly isolated and blockaded even before the formal disengagement later.
The failure of Camp David leads almost immediately to the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, starting in late September 2000. What sparked this one?
The immediate trigger was a highly controversial visit by Ariel Sharon, who was then the Israeli opposition leader, to the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem, accompanied by a large police escort. This was seen by Palestinians as an extreme provocation, asserting Israeli sovereignty over the holy site.
And protests erupted.
Yes. Protests erupted immediately, met by a lethal response from Israeli security forces. The conflict escalated incredibly quickly and was far more militarized than the First Intifada. It also crucially spilled over into Israel proper.
How soon?
In the early days of the Intifada, large protests by Palestinian citizens inside Israel expressing solidarity with Palestinians in the territories were met with deadly force by Israeli police. 13 unarmed Palestinian citizens of Israel were shot dead by police within about a week. This marked a severe rupture in Jewish-Arab relations within Israel.
This Intifada also saw a different horrifying tactic become prominent: suicide bombings.
Yes. The Second Intifada became tragically characterized by waves of suicide bombings carried out by Palestinian militant groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, primarily targeting Israeli civilians inside cities. The sources link the recruitment of young people for these missions directly to the profound despair, poverty, lack of political horizon following Oslo's collapse, and the daily violence and humiliation of the intensified occupation and closures. It created a pool of individuals feeling they had nothing left to lose.
And the Israeli response.
Was massive military reoccupation of West Bank cities, Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, intensified closures, targeted assassinations of militant leaders, and the beginning of the construction of the controversial separation barrier, largely inside the West Bank rather than on the Green Line.
Critically, this period of intense violence also saw a strong backlash against the post-Zionist critique that had emerged in the 90s.
Absolutely. The brief decade of grace for critical thought was slammed shut. In the atmosphere of fear and renewed conflict, the post-Zionist ideas were widely condemned as unpatriotic, even treasonous, blaming the historians and intellectuals for somehow weakening Israel or encouraging the enemy.
What forms did this backlash take?
There was intense pressure within academia. Scholars associated with post-Zionism faced campaigns calling for their dismissal or censure. There were moves towards textbook censorship, removing or altering historical accounts in schools that were deemed too critical or sympathetic to the Palestinian narrative. It signaled a powerful resurgence of a more hardline, uncompromising nationalist ideology.
Which the sources term Neo-Zionism.
Yes, Neo-Zionism. Characterized as a more fundamentalist, assertive, and often religiously infused version of Zionism, deeply skeptical of compromise, dismissive of Palestinian rights and narratives, and insistent on maintaining Israeli control over the occupied territories, often viewing the settlements not as an obstacle to peace, but as an essential part of the national project. This ideology became increasingly dominant in Israeli politics and public discourse in the early 2000s, marginalizing the critiques that had briefly flowered.
So the cycle seems to return to a hardened stance of exclusion.
Exactly. The space for questioning the foundational narratives, for acknowledging the other's story, dramatically shrank.
As we try to pull all these threads together, looking back over this century and a half, the central tension identified by the sources seems incredibly clear. This constant push-pull between political elites imposing national segregation and exclusion.
Versus this persistent, though often fragile, impulse towards cohabitation, cooperation, and shared life, emerging from ordinary people on the ground, driven by economic necessity or simple human interaction.
We saw that tension play out repeatedly.
Absolutely. In the Mandate era, you had the joint trade unions forming even as the Histadrut pushed for separation. You had the brief cultural opening of post-Zionism challenging the dominant narrative, even as political leaders failed to bridge the gaps at Oslo. At almost every major historical juncture, 1929, 1948, 1967, the Intifadas, Oslo's failure, the macro-level political dynamic driven by nationalist elites and the logic of exclusion ultimately determined the tragic outcomes.
Yet, even amidst this bleak picture, the sources conclude with a kind of provocative observation, a potential glimmer of hope found in specific local contexts within Israel today.
Yes, it's quite specific. It points to areas like the Galilee region in northern Israel, where there's significant demographic parity between Jewish and Palestinian citizens, and the Wadi Ara area near the Green Line, where Palestinian citizens are actually the majority.
And what's happening there?
In these specific localities, because of the demographic reality, the sources suggest you find intriguing examples of practical coexistence, shared municipal services, joint economic ventures, and deeper cross-communal relationships developing organically at the local level, not based on grand political agreements, but on the sheer necessity and habit of living side by side.
So even while facing overall discrimination, in places where demographic balance forces interaction, a different dynamic can emerge.
That's the suggestion. If the core argument is that violent exclusion from the narrative and from the land is the root cause of the violence, then these micro-level examples where exclusion is perhaps less absolute due to demographics might offer a hint of what a different future could look like.
A future based on sharing the land rather than dividing it or excluding one group.
Potentially. It suggests that a model for a shared, united land isn't inherently impossible if the dominant political ideology of exclusion, what was termed Neo-Zionism, could somehow be overcome or significantly moderated. The fact that these local success stories, however limited, exist despite the broader context of institutional discrimination faced by Palestinian citizens within Israel makes them particularly interesting.
Which leaves us with the final, really challenging question, doesn't it?
It does. Can this kind of micro-level, localized cooperation and coexistence, born out of necessity and proximity in places like the Galilee or Wadi Aras, ever realistically scale up? Can it overcome the powerful macro-level forces of nationalism, historical trauma, political failure, and the deeply entrenched ideology of exclusion that has defined so much of this tragic history? That leap in scale from local reality to national resolution remains the fundamental unanswered question.